recently I was appointed to an international advisory committee on AI for the Spanish government, which has been very interesting considering that they're within Europe, perhaps one of the most progressive governments right now. So it's gotten me thinking more about the impact of AI on work and workers. So perhaps it's worth taking a minute to reflect on what this perspective on Marx and the contradictions of capitalism tells us about AI and its potential impact. I suppose I break it down fairly conventionally into employment effects and skill effects. It's always possible that this revolution is different, but this technological revolution is different from all previous ones, but I'm not seeing any evidence to ground fears of mass unemployment. There's an enormous amount of hype surrounding AI and its potential impact on employment. There's not that many use cases where the outcome represents a major reduction in headcount. And insofar as there are some, the reality is we're talking about an expanding economy that can absorb those people into new tasks. I think a lot of people forget, this is probably less true for our Marxist audience, but a lot of the general audience sort of forgets that if a company deploys AI to dramatically reduce their headcount in the delivery of some service or product, and they derive a competitive advantage relative to their competitors through that, you could well imagine their competitors noticing and then using the same technology or similar technology to eliminate their headcount too, right? What's the net effect of this? The net effect of this is that the super profits enjoyed by the first firm that deployed the technology are going to be dissipated as their competitors deploy the same technology, and the price of the service that we're talking about will be reduced accordingly, right? So what that means is that the money people used to spend buying that product or service is now freed up to spend on other products and services, where expansion of employment, right, will soak up the displacement of workers from the first branch. And so I think, there's some pretty basic economics that people forget when they talk about displacement. They're so fixated on the fact that AI can reduce headcount requirements for a given task by, 40%, 60%, that they forget that if everybody does that and frees up all those people, they're also going to be reducing the price with some lag, right? But they'll be forced eventually to reduce the price, freeing up the associated demand to be deployed to other industries or other products and services. So as I said, it's always possible that this technological revolution be unlike any previous one. I'm not seeing any reason to fear mass unemployment. I get that this is a general purpose technology that can be deployed in a lot of areas, so it might impact a lot of different areas at the same time, but there's no evidence so far to support the idea that it's going to generate mass unemployment. So I think that's a red herring. What effect it has on work, content, and skills, that's much more interesting. And what's fascinating for me about the current situation is that it seems like there's a considerable degree of indeterminacy here. That on the one hand, there's some technological potentialities of AI, but on the other hand, the relations of production are going to determine what direction the deployment of AI takes. And it's not clear that it will make sense for that many industries to deploy AI to de-skill work. It depends a lot on the nature of the job, whether that's a good strategy or not. Everybody imagined that that's what would happen with radiologists, that radiology seemed like the perfect application of AI. Who'd need a radiologist anymore? Radiologists, go get another degree. You'll be out of a job in a minute as AI comes on. Well, it turns out AI has not displaced any radiologists. It improves the diagnostic capacity of the radiologists. It improves the quality of the service and not the amount of labor invested in the service. And so there's enormous opportunity for the expansion, the improvement of quality of services and products that are associated with the deployment of AI, enormous opportunity to develop new services and products, right? Both of which could augment the task set of workers rather than automating and replacing workers in those tasks. So augment them typically in a way that requires on their part, yes, maybe the abandonment of some craft skills, but also the development of some new technology manipulation skills. The radiologist still needs to know how to read an X-ray, but now they've got an AI tool pointing them to some places on the X-ray that might warrant some extra attention. That's pretty cool. Now, I don't know the radiology case is prototypical. I'm sure it's not. There are many use cases that could lead to different kinds of outcomes. But I think we're at a fascinating moment where, to some extent, whether AI ends up having a broadly de-skilling or a broadly upgrading effect depends a bit on public policy too. That's what I've been trying to tell the Spanish government. If they put into place the appropriate policies, they could create a context that would incentivize firms to take an upgrading path in their deployment of this technology rather than a de-skilling one. Obviously, in the American context, neoliberalism, being the prevailing ethos still, right? The regulatory context, the business mindset, right? All incline firms to use this stuff in a more de-skilling mode, unless they're in areas where, like radiology or some other areas where it's so obvious they need the goodwill and the mind of the worker involved as well. But in other countries, perhaps the institutional context might add public policy support for the potential upgrading path of AI.
Yeah, what's the uptake been like in practice in firms? Are they actually using it productively? Like, there seems to be an awful lot of slop in the media about what's actually going on.
Yeah, hard to tell. But no, it's having enormous and productive effects in quite a few arenas. I mean, yes, there's people who use it a lot in marketing to come up with more creative ad copy. So that's just a fucking waste of time. That's just unproductive labor in its worst form. And the fact that they just do that faster and better and more creatively, who gives a hoot? But no, in all sorts of other areas, it's being used very effectively. And it's a pretty flexible technology. So it's still in its infancy. And the forms in which we see it today, in particular, the kind of ChatGPT forms that many of us are exposed to, I think that's going to dissipate pretty fast. The limitations of that kind of technology will be pretty obvious pretty soon. But nevertheless, it's an enormous step forward, and firms are indeed using it for productive as well as kind of frivolous purposes.